The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. The boy was 12 when he learned the sound of a gun being racked. Not from a movie. From his bedroom window on the south side of Chicago. His mother pulled him down to the floor as shots cracked outside, sharp and fast, echoing between apartment blocks like they always did. By morning, yellow tape would wrap the street. Someone's name would be painted on a mural. Someone else would be gone to prison. And the city would keep moving. This happened again, and again, and again. For nearly 100 years, Chicago has produced men whose names carried more weight than the law. Men with tattoos burned into their skin, symbols of loyalty, violence, and power. Some wore suits and controlled unions. Others wore hoodies and controlled stairwells. Different eras. Same result. They decided who lived safely, who paid, who disappeared. From Al Capone's whiskey empire to the concrete kingdoms of the projects, these men didn't just break the law. They reshaped neighborhoods, corrupted politics, filled cemeteries, and packed prisons. And the scariest part? Most of them didn't fall in gunfights. They fell slowly, surrounded by money, fear, and silence. So how did Chicago become a city where gang leaders outlived mayors and prisons became command centers? That answer starts long before the sirens. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. Chicago did not wake up one morning and decide to become dangerous. It grew into it, slowly, the way rust spreads on metal when no one is paying attention. At the start of the 20th century, the city was loud with promise. Factories pulled people in from everywhere. Europe, the American South, small towns that had nothing left to offer. Brick buildings rose fast. Streets filled faster. But laws lagged behind growth. And order broke down where money moved quicker than rules. When alcohol became illegal, Chicago did not dry up. It flooded. That was when Alphonse Capone arrived, still young, still learning how to be feared. He had already learned how to fight. His knuckles carried early tattoos, crude marks from street crews back in Brooklyn. In Chicago, he saw something different. Here, violence didn't need to be constant. It just needed to be convincing. Capone learned that power came from systems, not temper. Fear didn't move on its own. It needed drivers, warehouses, protection, silence. He provided all of it. Bars paid him not because they liked him, but because broken windows were cheaper than funerals. Politicians didn't argue because elections were expensive and memories were short. Chicago didn't stop him. It adjusted around him. When Capone finally went down, not for murder but for taxes, the streets didn't cheer. They didn't change either. Men like Tony Accardo were already in position. Accardo didn't need noise. His tattoos crawled up his arms like a private record of every fight and cell he survived. He spoke softly, listened carefully, and removed problems without spectacle. Under Accardo, the outfit became quieter and harder to touch. Gambling dens ran behind respectable doors. Labor unions bent under pressure no one could prove. Chicago learned that crime didn't always look criminal. Sometimes it wore clean shoes and shook hands. Sam Giancana brought heat back into the picture. He liked attention. He liked being known. His ink showed confidence more than caution. But even his recklessness followed rules. The outfit still controlled the flow. Still avoided chaos. Still understood that fear worked best when used sparingly. While downtown crime dressed itself in respectability, the South Side lived a different reality. Black families arrived in Chicago chasing factory jobs and safety from the South. What they found were crowded buildings, underfunded schools, and police who showed up late or not at all. When factories closed and jobs vanished, entire neighborhoods were left behind. Protection didn't come from the city, so young men built their own. David Barksdale grew up inside that absence. He wasn't born violent. He learned it. He learned that walking alone meant getting robbed. That being weak meant being targeted. The tattoos on his body weren't fashion. They were proof of fights survived, of loyalty tested, of time done. The black disciples formed around discipline, not chaos. There were rules. There were consequences. At first, it looked like order. People felt safer walking their blocks. Then money entered the picture. Drugs followed, and rules hardened. When Barksdale was shot and later died, the streets held their breath. Then they reorganized. Larry Hoover stepped forward not as a fighter, but as a planner. He saw gangs as organizations, not just crews. His tattoos symbolized unity and authority. Under his leadership, the gangster disciples expanded beyond street corners into entire housing projects. Ranks were formalized, codes enforced, disobedience punished. Police arrests didn't stop the structure. They strengthened it. Prison became a headquarters. From inside cells, orders traveled through visits, notes, and loyalty. Young men on the outside followed instructions from men who hadn't seen the street in years. Chicago learned a hard lesson. Locking leaders away didn't always remove their power. On the west side, the vice lords rose through similar conditions. Abandoned buildings, broken schools, no opportunity. Their tattoos marked rank and belonging. For many, joining wasn't about crime. It was about survival. But survival came with costs. Violence spread in cycles. Retaliation followed retaliation. Children learned to recognize gunshots before they learned multiplication. Mothers learned which corners to avoid. Police responded with pressure, but pressure alone didn't heal what neglect created. Then Jeff Fort changed the tone. He didn't just want control. He wanted recognition. He reshaped his image, adopted new language, new symbols. His tattoos marked transformation, but they couldn't hide intention. Fort's reach grew too wide, his ambitions too visible. Federal attention followed. When it came down, it came hard. Chicago watched another leader fall, not in a blaze, but in paperwork and prison sentences. By then, Latino neighborhoods were fighting their own battles. The Latin kings didn't rise overnight. They built structure where chaos once lived. Their symbols and tattoos told stories of loyalty passed down through generations. Leaders like Gustavo Colón and Augustin Zambrano enforced rules that crossed city lines. Their influence extended beyond Chicago, but their roots stayed planted in its streets. Every group believed they were different. Every group made the same mistake. They believed control meant permanence. By the time the city entered the modern era, Chicago was no longer shocked by gang power. It expected it. Entire neighborhoods lived under invisible borders. Crossing the wrong street could change a life forever. Prisons filled with men who once ruled blocks now reduced to numbers and schedules. And still, new names rose. Because Chicago didn't create monsters. It created vacancies. And every time one leader fell, quietly, publicly, or forgotten, someone else stepped forward, already marked, already watching, already learning how to survive long enough to rule. That was the real beginning. And it was far from over. The city learned something dangerous during those years. Power didn't need permission. It only needed space. By the late 70s and into the 80s, Chicago's skyline kept rising, but whole neighborhoods were sinking. High-rise housing projects stood like concrete cages, stacked with families who felt forgotten. Elevators broke. Hallways smelled of damp walls and fear. Police cruisers passed by without stopping. Inside those buildings, a new generation watched and learned. Willie Lloyd was one of them. He grew up small for his age, quiet, easy to overlook. The kind of kid teachers forgot to call on. But inside the projects, being invisible was a weakness. Willie learned to move fast, speak little, and watch everything. By his teens, ink already marked his arms. Early symbols scratched in his skin with homemade tools, proof that he belonged to something bigger than himself. The black disciples had changed since Barksdale's time. They were rougher now, less patient. Power shifted from discipline to reputation. Willie understood reputation better than most. He knew fear traveled faster than respect. When the shooting happened, it wasn't random. It was loud, public, meant to echo. Lloyd was hit and survived, but the damage wasn't just physical. Word spread that he was weak. In Chicago, that kind of label killed faster than bullets. What followed shocked the city. Willie Lloyd didn't retaliate quietly. He orchestrated a response so violent and uncontrolled that it crossed lines even gang leaders avoided. Innocent people were caught in it. Children, families. The projects became war zones overnight. Chicago didn't see strategy anymore. It saw chaos. Police flooded the area. Politicians promised crackdowns. And inside the gangs themselves, something shifted. Leaders realized that uncontrolled violence didn't just bring heat, it brought collapse. That realization came too late for many. As Willie Lloyd's name spread, it became a warning instead of a badge. He was hunted not just by police, but by those who feared the attention he attracted. His tattoos no longer symbolized loyalty. They marked him as a liability. When he was finally arrested, the relief in the neighborhood was quiet but real. People slept easier. Kids walked a little faster, a little straighter. But the vacuum remained. And Chicago never left a vacuum empty for long. Across the city, Larry Hoover watched the fallout closely. From behind bars, he understood the lesson. Power had to look controlled. Order mattered more than terror. His influence tightened. Rules were reinforced. Messages became clearer. The gangster disciples evolved again. Meanwhile, on the west side, vice lords adapted their own structures. Some members tried to push legitimate fronts, community programs, outreach, even political connections. Tattoos still marked rank, but suits began to replace hoodies at meetings. The goal wasn't peace. It was longevity. Jeff Fort's downfall sent another signal. Ideology could attract attention, but attention invited destruction. His name faded into court transcripts and prison records. What remained was caution. Downtown, the old outfit was shrinking but not gone. Tony Accardo aged quietly, living far longer than anyone expected. His tattoos were hidden now, covered by long sleeves and distance. He didn't need to command streets anymore. His legacy lived in how others copied his patience. Sam Giancana's violent and reinforced a brutal truth. Flash invited enemies. By the time the 90s arrived, Chicago's gang landscape was fractured but vast. No single king ruled the city. Instead, dozens of smaller leaders controlled fragments, buildings, blocks, corners. Tattoos multiplied. Symbols changed. Loyalty grew thinner. Police tactics evolved too. Surveillance replaced patrols. Wiretaps replaced raids. Long investigations replaced quick arrests. Chicago learned how to suffocate crime slowly instead of confronting it loudly. But prisons filled faster than solutions. Inside those walls, leaders met. Alliances formed. Old grudges hardened. Tattoos expanded across backs and chests, marking history that couldn't be erased. Men who once ruled streets now ruled cell blocks. And still, the neighborhoods waited. Children grew up hearing the same sounds their parents had. Sirens. Arguments. Distant shots. They memorized escape routes instead of playgrounds. They learned which stairwells were safe, which weren't. Chicago didn't forget them. It just didn't save them either. By the early 2000s, the city stood at a crossroads. Federal pressure weakened major organizations. Public housing was demolished, scattering gangs across new areas. Old boundaries collapsed. New conflicts ignited. What came next wouldn't look like the past. It would be faster, louder, less predictable. And the names that rose from that chaos would carry tattoos not just of loyalty, but of survival in a city that never stopped producing kings. Some of them were already watching, waiting, learning what not to repeat, and preparing to take what was left. The next move wouldn't come from the shadows. It would come from the open. And when it did, Chicago would feel it everywhere. The first thing people noticed was that the rules were gone. When the high-rise projects started coming down, families were scattered across the city like pieces from a broken board. Old gang borders vanished overnight. Enemies ended up on the same blocks. Young men who once knew exactly where danger lived suddenly had no map. Chicago didn't get quieter. It got unpredictable. Larry Hoover's grip weakened as communication tightened around him. Messages took longer. Orders blurred. Outside, younger members argued over direction. Some wanted to hold on to structure. Others wanted fast money. Tattoos changed again. Less about nation, more about crew, block, survival. Leadership fractured. In that chaos, the streets produced new kinds of bosses. Not men chasing legacy, but men chasing immediacy. Short lives. Fast reputations. On the south side, names rose and disappeared within months. One season they controlled a strip of buildings. The next, they were gone, dead, locked up, or forgotten. Their tattoos were rushed, uneven, often covering scars from recent fights. Identity became urgent, not earned. Police adapted by going quieter. Cameras went up. Informants went deeper. Cases were built slowly, piece by piece. The goal wasn't to scare gangs anymore. It was to exhaust them. Meanwhile, the west side turned inward. Vice lords who once dreamed of legitimacy realized the streets had shifted beyond their control. Younger members didn't care about meetings or history. They cared about image. Social media replaced whispers. Reputation traveled faster than bullets now. One video could start a war. Prisons filled with men who never expected to live long enough to get out. Inside, old hierarchies clashed with new attitudes. Tattoos layered over tattoos, covering old loyalties with fresh ones. Respect inside depended less on name and more on who still had reach outside. Chicago's jails became mirrors of the streets, fragmented, tense, always on edge. Then the federal cases started landing. Long investigations wrapped around multiple crews at once. Indictments named men who thought they were invisible. Homes were searched. Phones were seized. Charges stacked. Leaders vanished overnight. Neighborhoods felt the absence immediately. Corners went quiet, then violent. Without leadership, disputes escalated fast. Nobody had authority to stop retaliation. Mothers kept children inside longer. Store owners closed earlier. Streets emptied before sunset. The city tried to breathe. But trauma doesn't fade that easily. Older residents remembered Capone's era through stories. Hoover's era through fear. This era felt different. Less organized. More reckless. Violence wasn't about control anymore. It was about presence. Be seen or be erased. In Latino neighborhoods, similar shifts played out. The Latin kings splintered under pressure. Some leaders sought peace. Others rejected it violently. Tattoos became louder. Symbols exaggerated to project strength even when influence was shrinking. Across Chicago, prisons absorbed the fallout. Men aged behind bars while younger ones took their place outside. The cycle didn't break. It just accelerated. And yet, something unexpected happened. Communities started pushing back, not through force, but fatigue. Mothers organized. Churches stayed open late. Former members spoke to kids who still listened. It wasn't enough to stop everything, but it slowed the bleeding. Police noticed fewer large organizations and more small crews. Easier to dismantle, harder to predict. Chicago was changing again. The old kings were gone or fading. The new ones didn't last long enough to build empires. Tattoos lost their meaning faster than they were inked. What remained was damage. Entire generations shaped by fear, loyalty, and loss. Streets where names changed, but pain stayed familiar. Prisons where men reflected on choices made before they understood consequences. And still, the city waited. Because Chicago had learned something else over the decades. As long as inequality lived block by block, someone would always step forward to fill the gap. Someone hungry enough to rule, even briefly. Someone willing to wear the ink, take the risk, and gamble with time. The next name didn't need history, just opportunity. And somewhere in the city, a young kid was watching everything, learning which moves failed, which mistakes were fatal, and how long power really lasted in a place that never stopped taking it back. That kid wouldn't dream of being remembered, only feared. And when his moment came, it wouldn't look like the past. It would look like now. By the time the city reached the late 2000s, Chicago no longer believed in kings. It believed in moments. Power rose and fell too fast to build thrones anymore. The men who once ruled entire neighborhoods had either aged into silence or disappeared behind steel doors. Their tattoos faded under prison lights. Symbols that once meant everything now reduced to stories told to cellmates who didn't recognize the names. Outside, the streets kept moving. The demolition of the projects had scattered old alliances into unfamiliar territory. Blocks that once answered to one leader now housed 3 different crews, each suspicious, each armed with memory and pride. Respect became fragile. Disputes didn't simmer, they exploded. And the city watched it happen in real time. Phones came out faster than fists. Arguments turned into videos. Videos turned into reputations. Reputations turned into retaliation. Violence wasn't planned weeks ahead anymore. It was impulsive, emotional, permanent. Chicago's police knew the pattern, but knowing didn't mean stopping it. Federal pressure had cracked the old structures. What remained were fragments. Young men wearing heavy ink that promised strength but delivered isolation. Their tattoos were bold, loud, rushed. Names of dead friends. Blocks they no longer controlled. Symbols borrowed from older generations without understanding the cost. Prison swallowed them quickly. Inside, something shifted again. The old leaders still existed behind bars, but their voices were quieter now. Younger inmates didn't always listen. Respect had changed currency. It wasn't about who built an organization anymore. It was about who still had pull on the outside. Who could move money? Who could influence streets they might never walk again? Some couldn't. Others adapted. Larry Hoover's shadow lingered, even as direct control faded. His name still carried weight, but the system he built was splintered beyond repair. The idea survived longer than the structure. Order without discipline turned into noise. Tony Accardo's story became legend, how silence outlived spectacle. But there were fewer men willing to wait decades for quiet power. Most didn't expect to live that long. Chicago had changed the math. Survival became the goal, not dominance. Neighborhoods bore the cost. Mothers learned new routines. Schools adjusted schedules. Community centers locked doors earlier. People memorized which blocks were active at which hours. Safety became temporary, conditional. Still, something else was happening beneath the surface. A different kind of exhaustion. Residents who had lived through Capone's stories, Hoover years, and the chaos after felt worn down. They didn't fear gangs the way they once did. They feared the endlessness of it. The sense that every generation paid the same price. Some former members tried to interrupt the cycle. Men with faded tattoos spoke to kids who still admired the look. They told them prison wasn't legendary. That loyalty disappeared fast. That the city never remembered the fallen for long. Some kids listened. Some didn't. Chicago didn't change overnight. But it slowed. Police focused less on headlines and more on patterns. Cameras replaced patrols. Data replaced rumors. Arrests were quieter, cleaner. Leaders vanished without warning, not in shootouts, but in courtrooms. The streets felt it immediately. Without leaders, crews fractured. Arguments increased. Violence spiked briefly, then burned itself out. Fear without structure collapsed into paranoia. And prisons kept filling. Inside those walls, men finally had time. Time to replay choices. Time to understand how short their reigns really were. Tattoos that once promised belonging now reminded them of doors that would never open. Some aged fast. Others hardened. A few reflected. Chicago's gangs didn't end. They transformed into something smaller, more scattered, less predictable. The city stopped producing Capones. Stopped producing Hoovers. It produced flashes, faces that appeared in headlines for a year, maybe two, then vanished. No documentaries. No statues. Just records. The neighborhoods noticed. Kids stopped dreaming of being legends. They dreamed of leaving. Of quiet. Of safety. Of boring lives their parents never had. But the pull was still there. As long as opportunity stayed uneven, someone would always step into the space. Someone young enough to believe they'd be different. Smarter. Faster. Untouchable. Chicago had heard that promise before. It always ended the same way. By the end of the decade, the city stood in an uneasy calm. Violence hadn't vanished, but it no longer followed familiar scripts. There were no central figures to blame. No single organization to dismantle. Only consequences. And the weight of nearly a century of choices. The question wasn't who ruled Chicago anymore. It was whether the city could finally stop producing rulers at all. Because somewhere, in a quiet apartment, a young boy was watching police lights flicker across his bedroom wall. Learning the sound of sirens. Learning the shape of fear. And Chicago knew better than to assume it had seen the last of him. The city didn't announce the end of an era. It never does. It just stops responding the way it used to. By the time the last of the old leaders faded into prison records and obituaries, Chicago had learned how to live with the absence. The sirens still came. The courts still filled. But the idea of one man controlling whole sides of the city felt distant, almost unreal, like black and white footage people argued about online. The streets told a different story. Power didn't vanish. It thinned out. Where empires once ruled, fragments took over. Crews with 5 names instead of 50. Corners instead of corridors. Buildings instead of blocks. Tattoos grew smaller, quicker, cheaper. Ink done in kitchens and basements. Symbols chosen for speed, not meaning. Loyalty lasted until the next arrest. Police adapted again. Not with raids that shook windows, but with quiet pressure that made life uncomfortable. Probation checks. Traffic stops. Phone pings. Court dates stacked close enough to drain energy and money. It wasn't dramatic. It was effective. Prisons changed too. The old bosses aged behind concrete walls. Their influence reduced to memories and stories told to younger inmates who listened politely and then did whatever they wanted. The ink on their bodies still carried history, but history didn't buy protection anymore. Outside, neighborhoods began to draw their own lines, not of territory, but of tolerance. Store owners refused to pay. Residents filmed everything. Kids learned to move differently, not braver, just smarter. Schools partnered with outreach groups that didn't promise miracles, only alternatives. None of it erased the damage. There were still families missing someone at dinner. Still birthdays marked by absence. Still streets where people crossed without looking at murals. But there was something new too, fatigue. A collective exhaustion with the cycle. Even the gangs felt it. Money was harder to move. Attention came faster. Every move risked exposure. The era of quiet control had ended, and the era of loud chaos burned itself out. What remained was survival without fantasy. The names that once terrified the city now lived mostly in archives. Capone as a cautionary tale. Accardo as a lesson in patience. Hoover as proof that power could outlive freedom but not consequence. Ford as a reminder that ambition attracts scrutiny. Lloyd as an example of what happens when violence escapes control. Chicago didn't erase them. It absorbed them. In courtrooms, judges spoke their names with the same tone used for any other defendant. In classrooms, students learned about them as history, not destiny. In neighborhoods, elders warned kids not with fear, but with truth. This is how it ends, they said. Every time. Not with glory. Not with loyalty. With silence. The city kept moving forward, unevenly, imperfectly, but awake. It stopped believing in kings. It stopped expecting saviors. It learned that when systems fail, people pay, and when people organize without care, they pay again. Chicago became a symbol not just of crime, but of consequence. And that matters, because the Real story was never about who ruled longest or who made the most money. It was about what happened to the city when power went unchecked, when communities were left alone to solve problems created far above them. The echo of those decisions still lives in headlines, court files, and prison yards across the United States. In the UK and Canada, similar patterns are studied, warned against, and sometimes repeated. Cities everywhere recognize pieces of Chicago's story in their own streets. That's why these names still matter. Not as legends, as lessons. The tattoos fade. The buildings come down. The leaders disappear. But the consequences linger, shaping policy, policing, and childhoods long after the noise stops. Chicago didn't win a war against gangs. It survived one, and it's still learning how not to repeat it. If this story felt heavy, it's because it's real. If it felt uncomfortable, it's because it should. These aren't movie heroes or villains. They were men shaped by their time, and they shaped a city that will never forget them. The next story might come from another city, another decade, another set of names. But the pattern will feel familiar, because once you understand Chicago, you start seeing it everywhere. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.